searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify, my television televise, I'm telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson and you're watching Palestine Declassified. We're the only weekly TV show focusing on investigating and exposing the Israeli regime's global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. In this week's show, we'll be exploring the symbiotic relationship between Palestine's struggle for freedom and Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. We'll be discussing the significance of the bond between Iran and Palestine after this report by Latifa Abu Chakra has been looking into some of the key milestones in this enduring alliance.
It is known that the Islamic Republic of Iran has stood with the Palestinians and all people resisting Israeli ambitions in the region since the advent of the Islamic Revolution. But the roots of this brotherly love are even deeper than that. During the PLO presence in Lebanon in the 70s, those working for the Islamic Revolution in Iran are believed to have trained directly with Yasser Arafat's chief military commander, Abu Jihad. The centrality of Al-Quds to the Islamic Revolution cannot be underestimated. The proud name of Al-Quds permeates throughout this historical process and is an ever-present mainstay of the state, which has been built since 1979. Imam Khomeini was crystal clear in his assessment of Israeli intrigue in the area. Everyone should realize that the world's superpowers' aim to create Israel does not end with the occupation of Palestine. They plan, heaven forbid, extending the fate of Palestine to all Arab countries. The leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, was given a hero's welcome in Tehran following the removal of the West-toxicated Shah regime from power. He famously remarked that every Iranian freedom fighter is represented in the Palestinian Revolution. Thanks to these decades of support for all who have sought to protect their societies from Israeli and US domination, there are now two clear axes in the region. The axis of resistance confronts Zionist aggression, and the axis of assistance helps Israel in a multitude of ways. As Saleh al-Aruri once stated, the Islamic Republic is the only state in the world with a budget specifically for the liberation of Palestine. It is not an overstatement to say there would be no coherent resistance axes in the region today without the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran.
As always, we're joined by our resident expert, David Miller. David's an academic and a former professor at Bristol University, and is now a non-resident senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zayem University. He's also a co-director of the lobby and watchdog Spinwatch, and is a leading British scholarly critic of Israel. And I'm delighted to welcome Syed Mohammed Marandi as our guest contributor today, who joins us via Skype from Tehran. Syed is an academic and political analyst, and he's regularly seen on Western media outlets commenting on the Middle East. In his day job, he's a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Welcome to the show. David, what do you think motivates the massive Iranian support for the Palestinian factions?
Well, it's seen as a fundamental issue of justice and indeed of peace in West Asia. It's seen as fundamental to the Islamic Revolution as well as to the wider region and the assessment of Iran of the wider region. So it's not something which is just a matter of politics. It's not just a matter of faith and religion, although it is, of course, very important from a religious perspective in Iran. Yeah. It's something which is almost intrinsic to the revolutionary outlook of the Iranian government and people, which came about as a result of the revolution in 1979.
Right, yeah. Well, Professor Marandi, I mean, what explains the prominence of Al-Quds in the Islamic Revolution?
during the revolution and before, the revolutionaries spoke of two key international issues repeatedly. One was the Palestinian cause, and the other one was South Africa and the resistance against apartheid. Immediately after the revolution, the government broke off ties, both the revolutionary government, they broke off ties with both the Israeli regime and apartheid South Africa. And Iran began to support both Palestinian groups. The PLO initially was obviously the main group. And in South Africa, Iran supported the ANC among other groups, and also the military wing of the ANC, which was considered to be a terrorist organization in the West. The whole of the ANC was considered to be a terrorist organization. So ultimately, when apartheid South Africa collapsed, Iran restored ties, and this second cause continues to be pursued by those revolutionaries and those who followed their footsteps.
Yes, yes, indeed. I remember Margaret Thatcher referring to Nelson Mandela as a terrorist not that long before he was actually released from prison. But David, I mean, has supporting Palestine been detrimental in any way, do you think, to Iran?
Oh, well, very much so. I mean, Iran is one of the most sanctioned nations in the world. Its sanctions being imposed on it have increased just the other day by the US and UK and by others. And so it very much has faced problems as a result of that. Of course, the sanctions on Iran are very much premised on their problematic position on the politics of West Asia as far as the West is concerned. And of course, that includes their support for the resistance in Palestine, without which, of course, there will be very little of the current resistance which we see in Gaza without the support of the Islamic Republic.
So, I mean, you think there's a direct correlation then between the...
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when Latifah was talking there about the axis of resistance, I mean, this is an actual functioning thing. It's not a matter of proxies. It's a matter of a functioning set of organisations working directly together in order to remove the Zionist entity from Palestine, but also, of course, to remove the US presence from the whole of West Asia. And that, of course, is the historic mission of all of the axis of resistance. And that of course, is something which they see is coming really quite soon, given the level of conflict that there currently is. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, what's your perspective on that, Professor Marandi, in terms of you know, the price that's been paid by Iran for its support for Palestine?
I would say that alongside Lebanon and Syria, no country has paid the sort of heavy price that Iran has paid for its support for the Palestinian people. Of course, the Syrians in recent years paid an extremely heavy price, and the Lebanese have also suffered immensely. But the Iranians have, over the last few decades, they've been punished with maximum pressure sanctions. The most brutal sanctions that exist, they're even more painful than the sanctions against Russia, because the whole banking system in Iran is isolated from the global banking system, which makes life very difficult. But it is all because of Iran's support for Palestine. The issue of Iran's nuclear program would have been resolved many years ago. It would probably never have become an issue if it wasn't for the Palestinian issue. Human rights and all other issues that the Americans raised in order to impose sanctions on the country are really linked to Iran's stance on Palestine. In fact, if the United States were to see that Iran's position was shifting on the Palestinian cause, they would go a long way to satisfy Iran. But it is a principle, as I said, like the issue of apartheid South Africa, the Palestinian cause is something that's sacred for Iran. And it's not something that the Iranians are going to give up. And it doesn't only have to do with the West Bank and Gaza. For Iran, the whole of Palestine has to be freed from ethno-supremacism and apartheid, and all people, Christian, Muslim, and Jews, must be able to live as equal human beings.
Yeah. I mean, and although, Professor Marandi, although Iran supports the resistance factions, I mean, that doesn't mean that they're proxies, does it?
No, absolutely not. I think this is projection basically from the West because they have many proxies across the region and across the world that do their bidding largely for financial reasons or to gain power. But the allies of Iran have a common cause, a common ideology, which is anti-hegemonic, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and therefore Iran supports them, but they have their own independence. Iran doesn't tell Hezbollah what to do, doesn't tell Hamas what to do, or Islamic Jihad, or Ansarullah, or the Iraqi resistance, or the Syrian resistance. But Iran assists all these people because Iran says that Iraqi sovereignty, Syrian sovereignty, Lebanese sovereignty, Yemeni sovereignty, and Palestinian liberation, they're all legitimate causes. And the reason why they're so successful is because they have popular support. Otherwise, the United States and their regional proxies or client regimes, they are much more wealthy. But the reason why they fail is because they are working against the people. They are working against the people of the region, but most importantly, with regards to our discussion, they're against the Palestinian people.
Yeah. And David, I mean, what can we learn about Iran's relationship with Palestine from the words of Salah al-Aruri?
So Aruri, of course, was executed by the Israelis in Beirut just the other week. But he was a senior Hamas commander and leader, and he had, in several occasions back in 2017 and 2019, made quite long statements about the way in which the Iranian government has supported the Palestinians, that the Palestinian resistance has moved from Molotov cocktails and sticks and stones to being able to fire missiles at the Israelis. And that is in no small measure, he says, in fact, almost entirely due to the Iranian government. And of course, he also says that there would be no such thing as the axis of resistance if it wasn't for Iran. And so although there are some who say, well, Iran's an imperialist power or it has ulterior motives, it's perfectly clear that the Palestinian resistance have never fallen out with the Iranian government, just as some have suggested over the question of Syria, for example.
Yeah. Well, we'll return to our discussion in a moment after our next report about the surprising cooperation between Israel and some of its near neighbours.
The only alternative to the axis of resistance in the region is the axis of assistance. Here are some of the greatest hits of the axis during the Gaza genocide. At the Islamic Arab Summit in Riyadh, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco and Saudi Arabia all rejected a draft proposal for an oil embargo and a restriction on the United States using their airspace to deliver weaponry to Israel. It is now known that to get around the Yemeni blockade of the Zionist port of Eilat, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Jordan have provided a land bridge, taking goods directly to the Zionist entity throughout the genocide of Gaza. The integration between the axis of assistance and Israel is deeper than many know. Elbit Systems, Israel's largest arms business, has established a new subsidiary in the UAE called Elbit Systems Emirates. Edge Group, a UAE state-owned corporation, invested $14 million in Israel drone manufacturer Highlander Aviation earlier this year. The Israel police employ their airspace management system, which was tested by the Israeli Air Force. It is well documented that Saudi security agencies use Israeli intelligence firms NSO Group and Celebrite to spy on people and hack phones throughout the last decade. Essentially, vital security state duties are outsourced to Israeli intelligence firms. The UAE also uses Israeli intelligence firm Celebrite to hack the phones of its own citizens in a deal that was directly brokered by the head of Israel's external intelligence agency, Mossad. The Saudi-backed Affinity Partners owns a stake in the Israeli automaker Shlomo Group. During the conflict in Gaza, the Shlomo Group contributed trucks and military equipment to the Israeli military's Shaldag and Maglan units. According to the Shlomo Group's LinkedIn page, it has also supplied hundreds of food packages to Israeli security agencies throughout this time period. The people of the region should take their pick: the axis of resistance or the axis of assistance.
David, what's your thoughts on that report about this Saudi-backed Kushner hedge fund that's actually invested in an Israeli company that's arming the occupation forces?
Well, this is quite a complicated question, but Kushner, of course, was Trump's son-in-law, who was given these kind of informal roles when Trump was president, and to fix things in relation to what they call the Middle East.
Yeah.
So he was the fixer. He went over to CMBS, the leader of Saudi, and they got them to invest $2 billion, I think it was, into this fund, and that allows them then to collaborate with the Israelis. Now, so what you see there is this is the Abraham Accords, the increasing normalization of the Zionist entity in parts of West Asia. It's an integration between Israel, the US, the Saudis, the UAE, and others, which means that we have effectively surveillance activities and intelligence activities of the UAE and Saudi contracted out to the Israelis. Right. So effectively, we're seeing a kind of Israeli imperialism. So for those who say the tail doesn't wag the dog, well, we're seeing something really quite interesting developing there, which contradicts all of those kinds of theories.
Yes, no, indeed. Well, Professor Marandi, I mean, what do you make of a UAE-owned company that's invested in an Israeli drone firm?
I think now that October the 7th has happened and we've seen months of genocide in Gaza, the Emiratis probably regret the course that they have taken, the path that they've taken, although they're not going to back away at this moment. The Emiratis and other regimes in the region have traditionally saw Israel as the path to Washington. If you want to gain access to Washington, if you want to have top-notch connections with the people at the top, then you do it through Israel. And it's not just the Arab countries in the region. This has been true for countries elsewhere and even powers like Russia and China. After what's been going on in Gaza, the mood has changed. I've been to China twice over the past 3 months on two very extensive trips, long trips, and the mood in China has become very hostile towards the Israeli regime, and especially public opinion. And the same is true in Russia. And in our region, the popular opinion has always been hostile, but now it is extremely hostile. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the Emiratis or anyone else in the region to push this relationship further, because even though they are in full control of their societies, but there are always powerful undercurrents that should be taken into consideration. What the Israelis have done to their own image and their own credibility, even among allies, is extraordinary. They've destroyed their status.
Yes, indeed. Is there, David, any significance in the fact then that the Saudis, the UAE and Britain all use Celebrite, the Israeli intelligence firm, to hack phones, don't they?
Well, yes, there is a significance. Let's remember, first of all, that the technology allows the Israeli owners of the technology, who of course are at the top are staffed with ex-Israeli intelligence officers, to access the data. So the hacking of the phones, which is done in the UK or in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, effectively the Mossad and Unit 8200 have access to that data. So that's one thing. Second thing, of course, is that this is being effectively, therefore, contracted out to Israeli intelligence. And we see the ways in which Israeli intelligence is able to penetrate the intelligence gathering activities in the UK and indeed in other West Asian countries too. So even if we have the situation which Professor Marandi was talking about there, that the Emiratis feel that they've gone down a road which they can't easily get out of, and it's very difficult for them. And certainly we can see some of their assets in the UK being quite pro-Palestinian in the last few weeks and months. But nevertheless, they are locked into these contracts for some considerable period, which means that they will always be the ability of the Israelis to spy on them and to spy on the people they're spying on.
Indeed. Professor Morandi, what in your view exactly qualifies a country to be part of the so-called axis of assistance?
Well, first I should add that the Israeli regime has a long history of these sort of relationships. In Latin America, whenever the American government found it problematic to aid its right-wing allies in that part of the world, they would ask the Israelis to do it for them. And that would give the Israeli regime long-term relationships and access to these very dangerous people. And that the same is true in parts of Africa. So in our part of the world, this access that they've been able to gain is something that will be long-term. The Emiratis, as pointed out by your previous guest, they have a lot of their own information is now available to the Israeli regime. But being a part of this, as you call it, axis of assistance, I think is necessary for those regimes that are completely dependent on the West. Yeah. These dictatorships that the Americans and the Europeans have imposed on the people of West Asia and North Africa, they do not have public legitimacy. These family dictatorships are not popular. In some countries where they're extremely wealthy, they can keep people in check through high-tech resources and also by giving handouts. But today, as the Israeli regime is becoming so universally hated across the region, it is going to be increasingly difficult for it to be seen as assisting the Israelis. We recall at the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring or the Awakening or the Islamic Awakening or whatever one would like to call it, it began with a young man in Tunisia who burned himself because of the way in which he was treated and because of poverty. And then suddenly we saw the whole region in uproar. So things may seem calm today, but who knows what may happen 6 months from now.
No, indeed. Well, David, I mean, which regional states are neither in the axis of assistance or the axis of resistance?
Well, in assistance, you've got most of the states in West Asia, of course, including, let's see, be clear, the Egyptians, Bahrain as well. But I suppose one state that one could point to is Qatar, which of course has 13,000 US troops stationed there, and CENTCOM, of course, which they famously used to invade Iraq from in 2003. But it's also referred to as a brotherly nation by Hamas, and of course Hamas are stationed there at the invitation, actually, of the US as a back channel. Yeah. So Qatar has a curious position. It's sort of a mixture of different views and interests within the government there. There are some who are very pro-Palestinian, others who play lip service to that. So that's a country where there's some kind of ambiguity. Now, what we should be looking for, I guess, is for countries to move away from that, either from the assistance into ambiguity or from ambiguity into a much more obviously pro-Palestinian position. Yeah. That would be the obvious thing which they should be doing and which would and could make a difference.
Yeah. Well, briefly, Professor Morandi, because we're almost out of time. I mean, the Western states that have withdrawn their funding from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency are being referred to as the axis of genocide. Would you say that's a fair description?
Yes, absolutely. It came right after the ruling by the ICJ, and it was obvious that the United States and its European allies wanted to put extra pressure on Gaza because the Israelis have lost the war and they don't have a road to victory. So it's either escalation for them to find some sort of road to victory, which I don't think is possible. It will only make things worse. Or they have to increase pressure on Palestinians. And I think that is one of the mechanisms that's being pursued. So the United States and the Europeans are very much a part of this genocide, and I think it's fair to call them the axis of genocide.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Marandri. I'm afraid we are out of time again, so let me thank our guest again, Professor Marandri, and of course our resident expert, Professor David Miller. Palestine Declassified will be back next week with more forensic investigations and analysis. And in the meantime, please share today's programme on your social media platforms to help us continue growing our audience. And remember, you can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. So until next time, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.